Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. A pleasure to have you. My name is Chris Mosier. I'm the communications director here at Progress Texas, and we talk a lot, sometimes with a limited degree of authority, I honestly think, about Christian nationalism. It is such a big topic. There is so much to it. We are very, very proud to welcome a person who I believe is probably one of the most leading authorities on Christian nationalism, certainly from the religious sector, if we can call it that, here in Texas. It's the Reverend Mara Richards Bim, whom I saw in action during a symposium at her church several months ago and was so impressed. She is the Justice and Advocacy Fellow at Royal Lane Baptist Church, which itself has a really interesting history that we'll get into here in just a bit. And, with James Talarico very much at the forefront of progressive thinking here in Texas lately, all over the headlines, bringing to the progressive side an unusually high degree of Christian talk and Christian teaching that, many of us are simply not used to seeing in our politics in Texas. Refreshing for those of us who come from a Christian background like myself. I'm born and raised Catholic and largely non-practicing, but still, my head is there a lot. And my heart as well. But for some of us, it's a new thing. And so we're super glad to have you with us, Mara, to talk us through all of this stuff. Let me start out by asking you about, and this is almost kind of a benefit of the doubt sort of question. It's not hard for me to imagine someone who is really steadfast in their Christian beliefs and is also sort of an activist thinker when it comes to political policy and government policy, to conflate those two things, to think that, well, I'm a firm believer in the teachings of Jesus, and so why wouldn't that be the cornerstone of what I think ought to happen with government policy? And I think that's a really kind and generous way to maybe ease into this idea of Christian nationalism. As we know, there's a lot more to it that's quite a bit more, I would say, nefarious, quite a bit more about power than it really is about Christian doctrine. But you have been up to your eyeballs in this for some good time. And so let me let you talk about this. Tell us about Christian nationalism, what it is, where it's coming from, and what should we think about it?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Obviously, there are a lot of different definitions floating around, but I think that I tend to speak about it in terms of the quest for power wrapped in the language and symbols of Christianity. Some folks have moved away from the phrase Christian nationalism because there's really nothing Christian about it if you really dig down into it. But yeah, it's this fusion. And then in the United States, there's an element, power being political power. So there is this fusion of political identity and a version of Christianity that we can debate whether or not is what I would consider heretical or Christian.
Right. Legitimate, you might say.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, we bring into this things like the idea of the prosperity gospel. Mm-hmm. We bring into it what we see as the spiritual aspects of MAGA, as we want, some people, as you want to define whatever that is. Mm-hmm. It becomes a little bit hard to tell where MAGA and all these other things and Christian nationalism, where they diverge, where they overlap. Mm-hmm. You got a real good up close look at that whole thing at the recent CPAC thing that went down, and kudos to you for attending that. First of all, did you stick out like a sore thumb? And second of all, what did you learn there?
Wowzers. So I, it's not the first time that I have ventured into spaces like that, but it was the most extreme. I have been twice now to Trump rallies when he was running for president, both the first time, or actually it was after he was elected the first time I went to a Trump rally and to write about it. And then more recently, when he was running this time, I also went. So I've been in those spaces before, but CPAC is on steroids.
It's a show, right? It's like,
it is. Yeah. And it's, this idea again of this fusion of spirituality, a lot of Christian rhetoric and symbols, but tied up with other things that are not Christian on this stage.
Yeah.
I did not wear my collar to the event. I I wore my cowboy boots one day. I tried to
There you
just
go.
really blend.
Yeah.
I will say I have this water bottle that has all these stickers on
Yep.
it,
I see
including
abolish ICE on there. Yeah, that's a dead giveaway.
right. And so I was afraid to take it out of my backpack
I bet.
because I knew that would be a dead giveaway. So I did the first day. I was so dehydrated by the end of the day because I just,
Yeah. Yeah.
It was, you can't sit in a space like that. I mean, it is just constant, hateful rhetoric, conspiracy theories, like for 9 hours straight. They don't take a lunch break.
Oh, wow.
It's just speaker after speaker after speaker. And like I physically felt it in my body by the end.
I mean, that's like cult. That's like
It is very, very, very cult-like.
That's like the boot camp or whatever you would call that, the indoctrination, the session that, to literally drill that stuff into your head. Can you think of just a few or maybe just a couple of specific examples of things that were said that you think might either be shocking to people or might kind of confirm for progressive folks listening to this, what they already think about this bunch?
Gosh, there was this moment where, the January 6th was constantly coming up and all the pardons and these people who had been, wrongfully accused and prosecuted. Blanche, our new acting attorney general at the time, he was just the second in command. He was there to sort of hammer home this idea that they're just righting the wrongs of the Biden administration, that all these people have been wrongfully persecuted by this administration. So there was just a lot of that kind of rhetoric. There was also, it was a day or two after Greg Bovino, the former all
4'8" of him.
Correct. After he quote unquote retired, he was brought out on stage to great thunderous applause and validation. And, I was in Minneapolis between Renee Good's murder and Alex Preddy's murder. I actually left and I was there when Bovino was there. He was throwing smoke grenades and whatever. And I left the day before Alex Preddy was shot. So I've, to see him brought out on stage and treated like a hero was unsettling.
That makes me think of, and kind of dragging this back to the religious conversation.
Yeah.
We've all heard our halfway apologist Christian relatives who happen to be Trump supporters. Very commonly, they'll say things like, "We didn't hire this guy to be a Sunday school teacher. We know he's not the most spiritually upstanding person himself, but he's doing our work. He's forwarding our agenda." And when you start to when you think of Christian nationalism as really just one avenue that this broader movement is using to exert power, it's easy to think of someone like Greg Bovino, who was literally like cosplaying as a Nazi, wearing the coat and doing the whole thing.
Right.
That, most of these people, I would again, benefit of the doubt, that most of these people are not, at least don't think they're Nazi sympathizers, but they see these people doing awful things as doing these awful things in the name of their own control and power. And so they're behind it. And so they get behind it. And so it becomes an ethical jump. You know what I'm saying?
They're very much about the ends justify the means. And I don't think that's really Christian, right? Like Jesus was all about how we treated our neighbors.
Sure.
So when you are willing to do anything and allow anything to be done in your name, that becomes a really dangerous ethical, religious, spiritual slope.
Right. And it's, you would think that seems so foundational to me, to what I know about Jesus' teachings, that someone would be able to wholesale dispense with that foundational linchpin of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
In the name of, again, forwarding political power is just, it's mind boggling. So for folks, and I talked a little bit at the top of this, there's many of us, again, myself, brought up in Catholic church. Many of us, perhaps brought up going to church as a kid, might have left that behind. A lot of people who forward their belief in science and their belief in, more secular sorts of modes of thinking might kind of, allow their religious lives to fall away to a certain degree. What is it about liberal or progressive folks that, given all of what we've just said, might have us finding organized religion generally unpalatable? And as one of the leaders of a very forward-thinking and progressive church yourself, what do you say to folks of Christian upbringing who still want faith to be part of their lives, to help them square what we so often see done in the name of religion that we really strongly disagree with? And that's not limited to Christianity necessarily. There are many awful things that happen in the name of the various world religions.
Mm-hmm.
What's when you come, you're bound to come across these kind of people all the time in your work. What do you say to those folks?
I say, yeah, I agree with them. There are really awful things, present day and historically, that have been done in the name of religion, and specifically, in my case, in the name of Jesus. I say, go back and read the Sermon on the Mount and find a church that preaches that, and that not only preaches it, but lives by it. And, and that's, taking care of the poor, tending to the sick. It is advocating for justice, both economic, social, all kinds of justice for people. Jesus was very much about the people on the margins and how they were treated by the establishment, especially the religious establishment. So it's sad that for the last 50 years, and I think especially in the last maybe 30, that kind of biblical Jesus following Christianity has fallen to the background, and a much louder, prosperity, gospel-driven, power-hungry version is the one that has dominated our cultural and political lives. But hopefully, my hope is that we're now at this point where our country sees what that kind of Christianity, that prosperity, power-hungry Christianity, what it has gotten us. And so I am hoping that the more progressive voices, the ones that actually believe Jesus and follow his words, are ready to step back into the political, social, cultural spheres and say, no, that's not Christianity, and showing a different kind of way.
Right. All of this is so, central to the topic right now because of the run of James Talarico for the U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
Who is a guy that, I couldn't tell you one single Democratic politician or candidate in Texas who has come near to the degree that he has espoused his religious beliefs and framed them in such a way that, just like we're talking about, where progressive people can go, yes, that's what I'm thinking about. Yes, that resonates with me. Let's talk about him in particular, because he's clearly scared the hell out of the Christian Nationalist bunch.
Yeah.
They're going on and on about how wrong he is, and it's just, and when you listen to, it is so strange. It's a striking thing for me to listen to James Talarico, and it resonates just so beautifully. And then to hear someone say, no, that's heresy, that's sacrilege, he's wrong, he's distorting Christianity. And I'm like, well, I kind of like what he's saying. So, would you please talk about his particular tradition, what you know about it, and describe for me how that might overlap or possibly diverge from what you guys do at Royal Lane Baptist Church in Dallas?
Yeah, he grew up going to St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and Jim Rigby is the pastor there, who has been influential for years in progressive spaces, sort of articulating a more progressive version of Christianity. So that's what I know about his background in terms of the church he grew up in. He's a seminary student, and folks, we're very similar, right? I'm at Royal Lane Baptist Church, which is affiliated with the Alliance of Baptists, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So these mainline churches are similar in the sense that we follow the lectionary. We emphasize the gospel message. So most often you will walk into one of these churches and you will hear a sermon about the gospel of Jesus, right? You go into a different kind of church, one that is more aligned with what we're talking about, Christian nationalism, and you're going to hear less often a message from the gospel. More often, you're going to hear the letters of Paul or text from the Hebrew Bible, what we would call the Old Testament. Very infrequently will you actually hear Jesus's words. Or if you hear his words in one of those churches, they're going to be kind of twisted to mean something that they don't, that when you read about you read it in its full context, it didn't mean that. So it's just a very different emphasis on which part of, we hold all of Scripture to be holy, but we emphasize the words of Jesus.
I want to kind of take you through a few of the Talarico kind of has his greatest hits. He's got his lines that he likes to throw out there, and all of which I love very much personally. But his opponents have very much taken a lot of the stuff head on. We know there are conversations happening in a great many churches and around many kitchen tables all around Texas about whether James Talarico has this stuff right or not. And the mega church types are going to tend to disagree with a lot of his positions. I would start at the top. Kind of the latest, greatest thing that they're really loving to talk about is the idea that God is non-binary, which to me, it's like, okay, I can kind of get behind the idea that God might be, a little bit more above just the crude matter of human physicality. And so it's not difficult for me to see. You could bring into that the notion that man was made in God's image, that sort of talking point from the Bible. Give us your take on the argument that that James Talarico's position that God is non-binary might be somehow wrong or offensive.
It's so funny because I was a career changer and I went back to seminary a few years ago and I said something similar in seminary. When you read the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, when you look at the original language, you see, for example, in Genesis 1, and I'm going to get this wrong, but essentially he, God, created, she, spirit, covered the face. So even in the very opening lines, when you read the actual language, God is referred to with different pronouns. And then when you get to the creation, with the second creation narrative, the one that we're most familiar with Adam and Eve, the text is something along the lines that in our image, we created them, man and woman, we created them. So both were created, both are reflective. And so I think, we live in this, gender is such a triggering topic for people right now. I think that what I would say to my Uncle Ron or whoever who, wanted to fight with me, I would say, I would point to those in Scripture that God is referred to with both pronouns, that humankind, male and female, both made in the image, and that God is spirit. God is beyond our language. Our language cannot even capture what God is.
Yeah.
And so to define God as either male or female is a reduction of what God is.
Yes.
And so in the very basic sense of the word, that is kind of what it means to be non-binary. And if that word is offensive and maybe you just need to do a little reading up on biology and understand what it means to be non-binary.
Well, let's be frank and say if there was more reading going on, a lot of this we wouldn't have a whole lot of these problems.
100%.
And of course, the non-binary thing is clearly, the counter to that is really a counter to transgenderism, and it's an expression that's made out of fear and hatred for transgender people, and that's clearly the case. I don't know if you listened to the Joe Rogan interview with James Talarico. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
It is the only Joe Rogan podcast episode that I have ever listened to. And I thought he did a terrific job. And of course, he impressed Joe Rogan, which was, nice to see. In that, there's a particular passage in that podcast that he talks about, which is about the Annunciation, the occasion upon which the angel visits Mary before the birth of Jesus to ask her consent to become Jesus's earthly mother. Mm-hmm. And James Talarico's assertion that story establishes a biblical basis for reproductive freedom. Mm-hmm. That is taken by Christian nationalist types as highly offensive. Mm-hmm. And the idea that Mary might have had a choice or some, thought in the matter of what she later became, which is the mother of Christ. that's somehow offensive. And so we get into, it gets really hard to square for people who value these things.
Yeah.
Talk about the Annunciation, what Talarico says about it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was listening earlier today to his interview with Ezra Klein.
Yeah.
And it was after his interview with Joe Rogan. And so they played that clip and then he talked more about it. I think it's fascinating that people are so up in arms to think that Mary consented to being the mother of Jesus.
Yeah. Why is that weird? Why is that hard?
Why? Yeah. Like, what kind of God do you worship if you think God forced her to do this?
Yes.
I mean, there's like, I just go back to the very like baseline of that. I think he is accurate in saying, that she consented and that establishes consent. I mean, I don't even know how to, like, it's a non-issue for me.
Sure.
In terms of abortion, because he was tying that particular story to a woman's right to an abortion. And there are other biblical examples of that. The Hebrew Bible places an emphasis on the mother's, the woman's well-being and puts it on par with any child she would carry. So, I think that it's a non-starter. I think that for my Uncle Ron, if he wanted to pick a fight over it, I would ask the question, what kind of God do you worship, if this is what you think God did? And just get them to acknowledge that she consented to being the mother of Jesus. Like,
yeah, that shouldn't be a hard thing to square. Even if you do have kind of these, antediluvian sort of ideas about, male dominance or female submission or whatever, just the idea that it's weird or somehow questionable that Mary would have had consent into what happened next is really strange and tells you something about the person who is questioning all of this.
Very much so.
Next up is James Talarico's support for the LGBTQ plus community is frequently cited as, some evidence that he is not following Jesus's teachings the way that he should. Your church, a great many of the progressive Christian churches, LGBTQ plus inclusion is a cornerstone of, you see it on their signs, you see it on the, rainbows on the steps and, all are welcome here. And all that stuff is a clear signal to that community for sure, which I think is wonderful. Talk about that from, the position, a leadership position within one of these churches, the idea that being okay with LGBTQ plus people might be somehow unchristian.
Again, I go by the words of Jesus. Jesus never talked about abortion, and Jesus never talked about some sort of prohibition against homosexuality, consenting adults in a relationship. There's a great documentary, the name of which escapes me, that came out a couple of years ago that was about the translation of Paul's letters, because you do have in Romans, he wrote about homosexuality. And when you go and you watch the documentary, you see that there is a mistranslation of that text. The text in the original Greek is referring to a prohibition against sex with younger boys, which is not the same thing as two consenting adults. And then I would also point readers to, in the Hebrew Bible, the story of, read all of David's relationship with Jonathan. You can't read that relationship and not tell me that the Bible doesn't include a loving homosexual relationship in its covers.
That story is in there. Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Very interesting. Lately also, especially here in Texas, on a couple of different levels, we've seen this bridging of the gap between church and state when it comes to our schools. The bringing of the Ten Commandments into the classrooms, the working of Bible studies into Bluebonnet curriculum, into the school reading assignments at our public schools. James Talarico's opposition to those ideas has been put up there as evidence of his unchristianness. Talk about the separation of church and state, specific to schools, specific to, what I see as an encroachment upon really, they want to talk about, parents' rights and having the parents have all the call. The parents aren't getting the call if the Ten Commandments are on the wall and there's a Bible story in the reading assignment. The parents have been taken out of that call. Tell us your views on James Talarico's views on the idea that these things should not be happening.
So I first encountered James Talarico when I was in Austin testifying against the Ten Commandments bill in committee. And I am one of the plaintiffs against the state of Texas for the Ten Commandments bill for putting it up in schools. We're appealing that to the Supreme Court. We just had the Fifth Circuit rule against us last month. And so I've been in the room multiple times listening to James Talarico argue around this and around the separation of church and state. Any religion that needs the state to enforce it isn't, I think, a viable religion first.
Right. And James has said that if you got to shove this down their throats, then you've got a dead religion you're talking about.
Correct. I found it particularly humorous, I guess, that when the Ten Commandments bill was actually brought up for the final vote, they did it on a Saturday, which is the Sabbath.
That's right. That's right. That is funny.
It just is so ludicrous. I'm Baptist, and James Talarico talks about his grandfather being Baptist and the long tradition of Baptists in the separation of church and state in this country. And so, in order for me to practice my faith the way that I want to, I don't want the Ten Commandments in my daughter's classroom. That is to your point about parental rights. I want to be able, as a pastor, to introduce the Ten Commandments when I think it's appropriate.
Sure.
And I don't think it's appropriate in this mangled version that uses archaic Old English language posted on a poster in the front of the room. We don't trust teachers to talk about sex ed. How
Right.
are we putting something up there that has to do with coveting thy neighbor's wife? It's all just so
It's weird.
ludicrous. Yeah.
It's so very weird. When I think of James Talarico and the cornerstone of what he said from a religious sort of standpoint is the core mission or the core message of Jesus for him is love God and love neighbor, just those two simple commandments.
Right.
How could anybody have a problem with that? It seems to me, and having looked into it for this talk, the definition of neighbor is what the problem is.
That is correct.
And there are a great many of James Talarico's critics who would say that not everyone is worthy of the love that these commandments would seem to dictate. Talk about that, if you would, and how you see the difference between judging who's a neighbor and who's not.
I mean, Jesus has a whole parable about this. We call it the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
And, over 2,000 years, it's kind of lost the kind of bite that it would have had for Jesus' audience. Samaritans were not just for Jesus followers and Jews of that era. Samaritans were not just, a different religion or a different ethnicity. They were the enemy, the most loathed, lowest human possible. And so his story of the parable is in response to someone who says, what do I do to get into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And it says, but who is my neighbor? Right? And Jesus with that parable is saying, the person that you least like, that you think you have nothing in common with, who's a different religion, looks different from you, that is your neighbor. And that's where I think people who say that not everyone, for example, immigrants in our country should be treated, as our neighbor, Jesus would disagree.
Yep.
And his parable, indicates that. I mean, he has a lot to say, not just with that parable, but, elsewhere he talks about what you do for the least of these, you do for me, right? Tending to the sick, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, taking care of the foreigner. What you do to them, you are doing to me. And so, the question of who is our neighbor is one that has unfortunately dominated our political landscape for the last decade, I guess.
It seems to indicate kind of a baseline divergence in the definition of what a Christian is.
Correct.
That if you're a Christian, clearly you follow these teachings. That's very central to that idea. And a lot of the things that I've seen about people who have decided that James Talarico is wrong about this kind of hinge this argument or this counter argument on the idea that if you're not a Christian, you're not a neighbor.
Right.
If you're a member of another religion, then you're by definition in some form of competition. Mm-hmm. or you're if you're not a Christian, you're an enemy of Christianity. It's you're with us or you're against us sort of mindset, which itself brings us back to the whole idea of Christian nationalism, which is this idea of power and dominance and competition. And so, wow, there's just so much to wrap our heads around here.
There is, yeah.
But this talk has been full of great, stuff to ponder for a long time for sure. We're coming up on time, Reverend Ben, but I want to talk about one final thing. Dan Patrick, who is soon to be on an election ballot near you, coming up in November. Our lieutenant governor is a member and a leader of not one but two state committees on the idea of freedom of religion. He has one in the Texas Senate and he has one at the federal level that has been put together by President Trump. What are your expectations of what these committees are likely to try to accomplish or try to recommend? And also maybe explore a little bit the idea that, there's a distinct difference in freedom of religion and freedom from religion, perhaps, for more secular folks. Mm-hmm. What do you expect Dan Patrick and his gaggles to come up with?
Well, so recently, the government issued a report that was titled something along the lines of documenting anti-Christian bias in the Biden administration, right? I suspect something along those lines will come out of Dan Patrick's efforts. There is, I think, a blatant effort to elevate one type of Christianity above all other faiths and above other kinds of Christianity. So it is about elevating one specific version of the faith that, again, based on power. It's a literalistic reading of the Bible, even passages of the Bible that are not meant to be taken as factual. It will, I think, continue to elevate that version of the faith and cause great harm to the rest of us.
Yeah, well, that we're soon to see. That definitely going to be some things going on in the upcoming session in the early 2027, and so we'll be following that for sure. This has been a fantastic talk. I feel like this has been one of those inch deep and mile wide talks, though. There's we could go on forever about any of the topics that we glazed over today. So really appreciate all the insight, and we'll definitely be coming back to this well if you'll come back at some point.
I'd love to.
As things come up, the Reverend Mara Richards Bim is the Justice and Advocacy Fellow at Royal Lane Baptist Church in Dallas. Great job, and thanks for being here, and we really appreciate the insight.
Thank you.